Welcome to Idaho Fish and Game's Hook and Bulletin podcast, your weekly news roundup of hunting, fishing, trapping, and conservation stories from around the Gem State. Hosted by Fish and Game's Public Information Specialist, Connor J. Lease.
For any of you headline skimmers out there, the takeaway of this year's deer and elk hunting outlook is one of optimism. Statewide, deer and elk hunting in Idaho looks positive heading into the 2025 big game season. Now the nitty-gritty, beginning with elk. By now, you've learned that mild winters are a winning recipe for building deer and elk herds. Typically faring better than deer, elk this past winter did particularly well. Specifically, 82% of collared elk calves statewide survived the 2024 through 2025 winter. On the other hand, survival of collared mule deer fawns was around 58%, an uptick from the long-term average of 57%, and 91% of collared does survived. Here's our state deer and elk coordinator, Toby Bedreau.
With 58% fawn survival, we're growing mule deer herds.
Now, before you rush down to the sporting goods store to buy a new fancy bow or rifle, not that you need our encouragement, remember Idaho is a big state, and not every region had the same winter. Fawn survival also wasn't uniform, and there are some troubling signs ahead, but more on that later. Lastly, there's whitetails. White-tailed deer aren't tracked the same way throughout winter as muleys and elk. But biologists do look for many of the same ecological conditions heading into spring and summer before they can make a reliable estimate on what the fall and winter hunting season may look like. But yet again, with white-tailed deer herds, it's estimated we're not only over the hump, but clearing that hump as if it were a down-dug fur. It's usually at this point in the summer, however, that biologists begin looking for signs of epizootic hemorrhagic disease, or EHD, which has a nasty track record of wiping out huge portions of white-tailed deer herds during the dog days of summer, as seen quite dramatically in 2021. Wildlife staff in the Clearwater region recently confirmed a case of EHD in a white-tailed deer in Unit 11, southeast of Lewiston. This is the first confirmed case of the season in the Clearwater region. It is still too early on to determine how serious this EHD detection may or may not be. However, regional wildlife biologists will continue to monitor the situation and keep hunters up to speed as we head into the fall. Now, let's shift gears and talk about last year's harvest for a quick sec. Big game hunters apparently got after it in the fall of 2024, accomplishing a statewide hat trick of harvest increases, the first time since 2020, of elk, mule deer, and white-tailed deer. Hunters are no strangers to swings in populations and harvests, and Fish and Game wildlife biologists highlight that each year. There are a lot of contributing factors. But last year's hunter harvest is a hopeful indicator that herds are once again back on track. Not to harken back and beat a frozen horse, but it always helps to remember recent history in regard to the brutal winter of 2022 and 2023. That winter didn't just leave its mark in the record books, it greatly impacted mule deer herds in Idaho. The hunting season that followed some 6 months later came as no surprise as statewide harvest dropped. But fast forward to 2024, a year that granted Idaho's deer and elk some much-needed reprieve from harsh winter weather. And now we could be starting to see the dawn of greener pastures for both big game and big game hunters alike. But moral of this story, increased hunter success across the board in fall of 2024 should be chalked up as a win. After all, hunters can't harvest animals that aren't there. There's not too much to go over in the lows department since harvest of all three species increased. But let's start with mule deer this time since they were the tragic stars of the dramatic 2023 winter. After a 22% drop in harvest, remember these numbers are statewide, from 2022 to 2023, it was enough to put a smile on any mule deer hunter's face to see that number grow from 18,568 to 23,898 in the fall of 24. And elk were no different. While the mountain bruisers didn't necessarily see the same impacts of that brutal winter as their smaller, long-eared cousins, Elk harvest in 2024 still rose roughly 13% from the previous year. Nearly a quarter of all general season elk hunters last year successfully hiked out the mountains with an elk on their back, a statistic also slightly up from the previous hunting season. This year's harvest landed at 97.5% of the 10-year average, which makes it about as close to a quote-unquote normal harvest as you can get with fluctuating annual harvests. Now, what about whitetails? What were they up to last fall? Well, I'm glad you asked. White-tailed deer represented the only X in the win column back in 2023's Hunter Harvest Report, where the primary W word was winter, not whitetails. But for the last 2 years now, white-tailed deer harvests have kept pushing the needle clockwise, accounting for roughly a 9% bump since 2022. In 2024, roughly 48,766 white-tailed deer hunters took home an estimated 20,908 whitetails statewide. Let's kick things off with elk hunting. If you recall, the drop in elk harvest 2 seasons ago was a bit of a head-scratcher. Anecdotally, we heard reports from experienced elk hunters who were not finding elk in their usual spots during fall and suspected that maybe a combination of hot temperatures and scant precipitation might have been a significant factor. Toby Bedreau stated that the dip in statewide harvest did not reflect a dip in the overall elk population, but it would possibly take another year to know for sure. And now, a year later, that's exactly where we're at. And fish and game biologists believe the statewide elk population is healthy and relatively stable.
While things vary from elk zone to elk zone, statewide elk populations tend to stay relatively stable from year to year.
Environmental conditions can sometimes have misleading observations when it comes to the perception of populations. For example, rain was plentiful in August of 2023, which led to fantastic summer range conditions for elk. Combined with a mild fall, elk didn't necessarily feel the need to lock up their summer vacation homes and head to cooler habitat. So the effect, in our minds, as hunters at least, was the perception of fewer elk on the landscape. In reality, the elk were still there on the landscape in 2023, just not on the same landscape as us. That's all good and well, but what about this year? Overwinter survival and collar data concluded in May, indicating excellent conditions for Idaho's elk heading into summer. Remember that every year, Fish and Game wildlife biologists collar and track deer and elk survival throughout the winter, paying especially close attention to that data in April and May when the animals are at the end of their rope nutrition-wise. While elk, hardy as they are, tend to fare better than deer, it's always cause for celebration when their survival numbers stay relatively high. With yet another mild winter in 2023 through 2024, elk herds across the state will continue to grow as Bedreau forecasts bigger herds this fall than last.
Seasonal factors like mild winters and spring moisture are how to get healthy herds as far as elk go. This year, we're anticipating early antler growth among bulls and fuller-bodied calves and cows.
Factors such as wildfire and dry conditions could still shuffle the deck in the months and weeks leading up to the elk opener. Dry conditions, for instance, could mean fewer food options available on the hillsides, forcing herds to head for greener and higher pastures. But, and I'll leave you with this, the flip side to that is a mild summer. So far this summer, you can count the number of triple-digit days on one hand, with most days sticking to the 80s and 90s, depending on where you are in the state. In years past, summers with higher average temperatures have noticeably played a role in elk distribution. Recall that head-scratcher season of 2023? Well, that's exactly what can and could happen if we see an uptick in temperatures later this month into mid-September. As I'm recording this, it is early September, so chances of that aren't very likely compared to when this was written, but still worth considering. For now, look forward to another average to above average season in the mountains, chasing after Rocky Mountain elk. Here's last year's numbers. Total elk harvest in 2024, 20,996. 2023 harvest total, 18,568. Overall hunter success rate, 24%. Antlered, 12,610. Antlerless, 8,390. Total taken during general hunts, 13,170, or 19% success rate. Taken during controlled hunts, 7,830, or 42% success rate.
With 31 game species and over 35 million acres of publicly accessible land, hunting in Idaho is unmatched. Idaho Fish and Game hopes you make this your best season yet and reminds you to do your part and ensure it's a safe, ethical, and enjoyable season for others as well. Be sure to review the seasons and rules before heading out. And if you purchased a big game tag, don't forget to submit your mandatory hunter report. Your first-hand data is the science needed to help manage populations for the future. For tips to plan your hunt, check out GoHuntIdaho.org.
Let's talk about mule deer hunting. Now, not to say we told you so, but we told you so. We predicted a bump in statewide mule deer harvest last fall, and lo and behold, that's what happened. That's simply because mule deer population cycles are relatively predictable, and harvests tend to follow those cycles. A total of 73,748 mule deer hunters successfully harvested 23,898 mule deer, which was nearly a 30% year-over-year increase. Mild to normal winters typically grow Idaho's mule deer herds, or more accurately, allow herds to grow, which boosted mule deer herds and led to this prediction in last year's Big Game Outlook. Quote, healthy fawn crop that survived winter means more young antlered bucks that will be sporting spikes, forked horn antlers, and a small percentage will be 3 points. Those young bucks represent a large portion of the annual buck harvest, so it's likely hunters will see an uptick in the fall. All right, now heading into 2025. Another normal winter means odds are in our favor that we'll have as good or better mule deer hunting than last year. As stated above, survival of collared fawns last winter was around 58%, a point up from the long-term average of 57%. All news isn't good news, but let's start there. After the southeast region was hit hard by a catastrophic winter in 2022, it posted some of the highest fawn survival rates in the state last winter, which bodes well for herds in the eastern part of the state. Things were opposite, though, in the southwest region, which is one of the state's most popular mule deer regions. Despite a normal winter, Unit 39 had only 31% survival of collared fawns. That doesn't mean there's need to panic, at least for now. Unit 39 still has one of the largest mule deer herds in the state, but low fawn survival is a sign that the herd is reaching the limits of its habitat. Biologists have seen lighter fawns coming into recent winters, and fawn weight is an accurate predictor of the winter survival.
Light fawns often indicate some habitat limitations on summer range.
In other words, too many mouths and not enough groceries, which could lead to something that's counterintuitive to many hunters, the need to harvest more deer, including does. To get a healthy and sustainable herd, you don't want just large numbers. You want hardy and you want productive mule deer. Otherwise, a hard winter could hit those herds harder and drop them even further. But when we look across southern Idaho, most mule deer herds are healthy and stable to growing in most areas, so the potential is there for an above-average hunting season. Now for the usual disclaimer. A boost in herds isn't always followed by a boost in harvest. A hot, dry October can make hunting conditions difficult, have animals scattered over vast areas, and decrease the harvest. The opposite is also true. Rainy or snowy fall weather can start migrations to lower elevations and put more deer in contact with hunters. Not to overstate the obvious, but more deer in the fields and woods means better chances for a higher harvest. And things get better because consecutive normal winters also mean more bucks are likely reaching maturity, so there may be more larger bucks available. Last year's numbers. Total mule deer harvest in 2024, 23,898. 2023 harvest total, 18,329. Overall hunter success rate, 32%. Antlered, 20,515. Antlerless, 3,380. Total taken during general hunts, 17,940, or 28% success rate. Total taken during controlled hunts, 5,960, or 53% success rate. All right, let's talk about whitetail deer hunting. Fall 2022 was a low spot for whitetail deer harvest. The reason for that 10-year low was not bitter cold, but hot, dry weather and biting midges. Epizootic hemorrhagic disease, or EHD, wreaked havoc on the Clearwater region's whitetails that summer, killing an estimated 6,000 to 10,000 deer. So to see 2 consecutive increases in whitetail harvest is a good sign for wildlife managers and hunters alike that whitetail herds are moving back in the right direction. An estimated 48,766 whitetail deer hunters hit the woods last year, with 40% of those successfully bagging a deer. Who knows, maybe the same 48,766 hunters went 2 for 2 during the past 2 years, as harvest success was identical. But I doubt it. As predicted, though, heading into the 2024 hunting season, overall harvest numbers for whitetails increased from 19,828 to 20,908. Like with any species, and as mentioned countless times in regard to mule deer, it takes time for animals to rebound, but whitetails tend to rebound a little more quickly. Back in early 2023, Boudreaux forecasted another 2 to 3 years before the Clearwater's whitetail herds would be fully recovered, but optimistically pointed out that they were in fact over the hump. And while the jury's still out on East Idaho's mule deer, the verdict on the Clearwater's white-tailed deer is in. The herds have bounded right back. Like with other big game species, there are different environmental factors that can impact herd health. Temperature, annual precipitation and snowpack, drought, wildfires, etc. are environmental variables our biologists consider when determining how and where deer and elk are going to be in the months leading up to opening day.
Body size and antler growth on this year's whitetail deer is looking solid.
When it comes to whitetails, the picture couldn't look better. As the herds continue to build back up, a mild winter, a precipitous spring, and a relatively fireless summer so far have all been positive ingredients for successful fall. With that said, this time of year is when EHD typically rears its ugly head, and biologists are still monitoring a recent EHD detection in Unit 11. For more on that case, check out our website. Last thing worth mentioning, back in 2023, Fish and Game wildlife biologists began a comprehensive tooth collection project, that's deer teeth, to help determine the age structure of white-tailed deer in a few North Idaho hunting units. Teeth collected from whitetails, specifically the front teeth, are sent to a lab and aged to determine a range of how old or how young harvested deer are, and by extension, the age structure of the rest of the deer out there on the landscape. Additionally, in 2024, biologists asked hunters to measure the circumference of buck antlers harvested that season. The 1,100 white-tailed deer teeth collected in the project's inaugural year, combined with last season's 1,500 teeth and 700 antler measurements, have helped our biologists determine a wider spread of ages among deer than previously thought.
Hunters were telling us that all they were seeing were younger bucks, but thanks to our tooth data and the hunters who submitted those teeth, the data shows that we're actually quite a bigger spread of buck ages in the population.
Our biologists are once again looking for white-tailed deer tooth submissions during the 2025 hunting season. For more information, you can check out the press release on our website or contact the Panhandle or Clearwater regional offices. Last year's numbers. Total white-tailed deer harvest in 2024, 20,908. 2023 harvest total, 19,828. Overall hunter success rate, 40%. Antlered, 14,270. Antlerless, 6,640. Total taken during general hunts, 19,360, 40% success rate. Total taken during controlled hunts, 1,550, or 46% success rate.
The CWD Report.
Hunters in 2025 will have mandatory testing for CWD for deer in 7 hunting units, including the addition of Unit 63A north of Idaho Falls, which was added after a domestic elk tested positive on a private game operation. Our biologists are currently managing CWD through 3 main methods. 1, statewide voluntary testing of deer, elk, and moose by hunters. 2, mandatory testing for deer in units where it's required, which include portions of Unit 1 and Units 14, 18, 23, 24, 32A, and 63A. And 3rd, CWD management zones, mandatory testing, and other special regulations. Currently, Units 14, 18, and a portion of Unit 1 comprise the CWD management zone for 2025. CWD testing is mandatory for all harvested deer in those units, and the following rules also apply. It is unlawful to transport any whole carcass of a deer, elk, or moose out of a CWD management zone except heads or lymph nodes transported to Fish and Game for CWD sampling. Antlers or skull caps may be retained after sampling by Fish and Game staff, but the remainder of the head will remain for proper disposal. For details and full rules, check out our CWD webpage. Heads should remain in the field if lymph nodes are removed for delivery to Fish and Game for CWD testing. Caped animals with the skull may be taken to a taxidermist or meat processor, but may not leave a CWD management zone and must still be presented to Fish and Game staff for sampling. Heads or lymph nodes must be submitted for testing within 10 days of harvest, and if hunters or those who salvage an animal retain the quarters, they should double bag all bones and non-edible portions of the animal and dispose of them in a landfill when finished processing the meat. There will be mandatory testing in Units 23, 24, 32A, and 63A, but no carcass transport restrictions. Here's what I mean. CWD testing is mandatory in those units for all deer, but does not apply to elk and moose taken in those units. These units are not within the CWD management zone, so carcass transportation restrictions do not apply. Fish and Game also welcomes any voluntary testing of elk and moose. Now, this is something I want to highlight here. Why is CWD management important for hunters? Fish and Game's CWD management priority is keeping the percentage of animals infected or the prevalence low in deer herds. CWD can't be eradicated because it remains in the environment for decades, so keeping the prevalence low will help maintain healthy big game populations. All right, folks, we're wrapping this puppy up, but last thing I want to mention are mandatory hunter reports. Hunters are reminded to fill out the report 10 days after harvest, or if you did not hunt or harvest deer, elk, and pronghorn only, 10 days after the closing date of your season for each tag purchased. When you file your mandatory hunter report, you give our staff critical hunt and harvest information that our wildlife managers can use to maximize and sustain healthy herds. So help us collect this vital information and conserve your hunting, fishing, and trapping dollars. For more information on mandatory hunter reports, check out our Mandatory Hunter Report webpage. All right, that's all I got. Best of luck out there this year, folks. I know a bunch of you are already out there bugling for bulls, so this deer and elk report might be hitting your ears a tad late, but that's okay. It's still going to come in handy as we get into the meat of hunting season later on. As always, we appreciate you listening to our podcast. Let us know if you're enjoying it or not. If you are, maybe tell your favorite hunting buddy or fishing buddy this podcast exists. We've had the Hook and Bulletin going strong now for over a year. It still amuses me when someone comes up and is like, I didn't know you had a podcast. You're darn right we do. So hopefully you find it enjoyable to listen to and find it informative. Write us a note, though, at podcast@idfg.idaho.gov. That's podcast@idfg.idaho.gov. Do my best to answer every question that comes in, so write us a note. Shoot us an email. Something on your mind or got a basic question for us, want us to let us know, write us an email. So best of luck to you listeners out there. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next one.